somewhere, and maybe it's the wife, maybe, or, whatever the partner is, or and two children. By the time you fight and fight and fight in course, you might be fighting about $5,000. You spent $95,000 fighting it in court. If you have an estate plan, if you've talked to a lawyer, lawyers are very important. People tend to talk about them as if they're like this expense. I've also had the experience of seeing people, once they have had the opportunity to have some sort of financial advantage, what it is that they choose to do for their children. And all of those experiences are important because it tells us a little bit about the psychology of money. And with that, I think that sometimes it's like transitioning from a lack mindset to a having mindset is not always healthy, right? Because from survival mode to having, you might want to spoil children. You might want to provide certain things. Like my younger siblings had, like the PlayStations, the newest one that happened, the newest ones that came out, but there was not a financial learning opportunity that was taken in that, because for them, they were celebrating, and they should have celebrated. They were able to do so much. And I don't know if you hear my child in the background, like this is a person who's very privileged because they have technology, they have things that cost a substantial amount of money for them to be able to have those things. And so there is a level of privilege that occurs because we are not in the survival mode that existed for my parents. Now, the problem comes then, while they're celebrating and while they're providing those things for them, are we actually giving the lessons that are necessary? Like, hey, there was a time when I came to this country, I didn't know where I was going to live, and this is what I did, and this is what the transition is. And this is the importance of history. Because if you understand the history of where your parents got to where they are, then maybe you might have a little bit of caution and not feel as privileged and realize that what you have was given to you, right? So I was given the opportunity to decide where it is that I'm going to work for my first job, whereas my parents did not have that choice, right? There's a psychological component, there's a financial component, and there's also a component whereby I'm comparing this to the peers that I go to school with. So I have peers who are not concerned about where they're going to live because they live in a house that their grandparents bought, and maybe they inherited that, and me as coming from an immigrant background, I understand I'm not inheriting land in America. And if there's land that I'm inheriting in Kenya, my parents have the responsibility of actually explaining to me what that means. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity in the future to kind of, within this conversation, to talk about estate planning and what that really, really means for the individuals. But that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what is it that we gain from what our parents had experienced here in the diaspora. And for those of us who have parents who invested back home while they were trying to build here in the States, but they were building back home, or maybe they had parents who give them something, they have an inheritance. Can we talk about what does that mean for the next generation? What does that inheritance mean? What is the estate planning for those assets to actually be transitioned from one generation to another? That does not require me to go to court, because in the United States, it's probate court, and that's very costly. And at the end of it, you end up paying the government before you've even gotten anything yourself. And in Kenya, I know there's some similar situations where maybe family members are suing each other because things are not in writing. And that becomes the next state. I guess the next level of all of this conversation we're having.
Yeah, now Annette, you've touched a hornet's nest. And the reason why I'm saying you've touched a hornet's nest is I personally believe or feel like a lot of parents here in the US who have a high portion of their net worth invested in Kenya. I think this is something, like when we talk about estate planning or succession, if they have businesses or entrepreneurship back in Kenya, this is something that I think has not been thought through. And this is where, in my own view, I feel like there should be, like, parents should have their children in mind, in every major financial decision they make. Doesn't matter how young they are, like 5 years old.
Absolutely.
Yes.
In the United States, the statement is, as soon as your child gets a Social Security number. So for those of you who may not have given birth here in the United States, you give birth, you report to the Department of Health, and then 2 to 3 weeks later, you get a Social Security number, right? And there's a saying, as soon as my child gets their Social Security number, because you need that to register for certain financial products, they get a, number 1, life insurance policy. Number 2, they start investing in investment products that they're able to do and I'm not going to talk about those investment products because that's not my area of expertise, but I can tell you that there are investment products that you can start investing in children the moment that you have a Social Security number. And the reason why this is important is because we have to understand, in the context of the country that we are in the United States, there are systems in place and there are things that individuals are doing in order to set their children up for success. And we no longer have the excuse that we do not know, because we've been here for a couple of decades. That excuse does not exist anymore. So the moment my children are born, they have a Social Security number. One of the first things they have is a life insurance policy. Conversation for another day, but that's one thing that is actually an investment product, in a sense, and it's a wealth transfer product, which I can say very confidently as a licensed insurance agent. But additionally, we're thinking about credit. We're thinking about how can we include them as the beneficiaries of our 401ks. A lot of people have 401k because they're working for a company that provides that option for them. Who is going to benefit from that if something were to happen to you? Estate planning is very important. Now, when you go and many people have experienced this where someone passes, unfortunately, it's sudden, it's something that we have not planned for. And now a mother is suing the son because who gets the land when the father has died, when the husband has died? That's land back home in Kenya. Even here in the States, who inherits, because you can transfer your 401k, you actually can decide who gets the distributions. So there might be something, and what we call it in the United States is probate court. Probate court is very costly. So let's say that we're talking about $100,000, which is not actually a lot of money. Let's say you've worked for 20 years for a company and you have $100,000 somewhere, and maybe it's the wife, maybe whatever the partner is, and 2 children. By the time you fight in court, you might be fighting about $5,000. You spent $95,000 fighting it in court. If you have an estate plan, if you've talked to a lawyer, lawyers are very important. People tend to talk about them as if they're like this expense that is unnecessary. Lawyers can be very important to help you with some of these things. If you have an estate plan that is in place, then you can avoid all of the probate fees. You can avoid the lawyer fees and all of that. Who gets the house? How is the house being split? If all of the kids are getting the house and they have to sell it and they have to split it, and it's lined up and all of that stuff, you are actually saving your family a lot of emotional stress as well as the financial component by doing those things.
Yes, and I think one area where we've had plans of having like some expertise in studio is estate planning, both from the American side and also on the Kenyan side, because we're not here to maybe advise people or tell people invest here or don't invest here, but I think you must know the pros and cons, like especially from your children's perspective. You have to think about yourself, or you have to think about what happens if I die tomorrow. What happens to my minor children? That's what you have to think. And of course, if you have assets that are far out, like in Kenya, for example, the degree of difficulty increases for them because they don't know how to maneuver in Kenya. It's more difficult for them to maneuver there, even if you have a lawyer there. So those are the things that I think that people need to have in mind. And I think, like we do have some people, like who are tuned in here, who are familiar with life insurance, familiar with estate planning and all that, because that becomes very critical. Like when something happens, you have to think, even when you go to an insurance agent, because sometimes, like for me personally, I tend to look, and not in a bad way, but to me, any person who I'm going to purchase a financial product from, I have to tell myself that this person does not know me as much as I know me. So whatever recommendation they give, you're the one who knows, like, if I were to die tomorrow, what happens to my daughter? What happens to my son? What happens to my spouse? Like, I think actually before going to any insurance agent, any life insurance agent, I think these are questions that you want to answer yourself first before looking into the products, because these products sometimes can be confusing. You'll be introduced to acronyms like DIME. Like for me personally, DIME is debt, income, mortgage, and education. Yeah, for me personally, and this is not for everyone, to me, the E part, education, that's not an emergency, but that's what will be sold to you.